in the Idaho Territory in the autumn of 1881, on a wagon road that ran north from the Snake River toward the mining camps of the Salmon Country, there stood an abandoned trading post that no man in 3 counties would have paid $1 for. The roof had fallen at one corner, the front window was a black hole stuffed with rags and old sacking. Pack rats had taken the cellar and wasps had taken the eaves, and the man who held the deed had let it go to the territory for back taxes, because it cost more to repair than it would ever return. Woman of 20 bought it for $2 on a cold morning in October, and the men who watched her count the coins out laughed into their collars, because she had no horse, no husband, and no sense, and they were certain she would freeze in it before the first snow melted. Her name was Della Hart, and she did not laugh with him. She folded the receipt the clerk gave her into a square the size of a playing card and put it inside her glove, against her palm, where she could feel it. She had learned that habit from a dead man, and the dead man had taught her more than that, though no one in the room knew it. They saw a thin girl in a brown coat, too large for her, standing in front of a building that leaned. They did not see what she saw, which was the joinery of the door frame, and the way the sill had been set, and the particular care a builder takes only with a thing he means to last. What she did not yet know was that the post held a sealed passage behind its counter, and that the passage held the answer to a wrong that had been buried for 11 years, and that the answer would cost her more labor than she had ever given to anything. Yet she knew the first part of it. She knew that a building put up by a careful hand keeps its secrets in the places careless men do not look. And so on that October morning, with $2 gone and a receipt against her palm, she walked the half-mile out of the settlement of Cobb's Ferry to the trading post that was now hers, and she stood in the doorway, and she began. Stay with me through the cold of it, because the thing she found was worth the waiting. She had come to the territory the way a stone comes down a hillside, which is to say she had not chosen the road, only the falling. Her father had a hard religion and a harder temper, and when she was 20, he had put her out of his house in the Willamette country over a matter she would not name even to herself, and she had taken the stage east with $11 and the clothes she wore and a single tool wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her bag. The tool had been her grandfather's. He had been a joiner and a millwright, a man who made doors and cabinets and the long counters that ran the length of a frontier store, and he had taken her on as his shadow from the time she could hold a chisel, because his own sons had no patience for the work and she had nothing but patience. He had died in the spring before her father turned her out. She had sat with him at the end, and he had not spoken of heaven or of money, because he had little of either to leave. He had spoken of wood. He told her that a board has a grain and a will, and that a builder who fights the grain will lose, and a builder who reads it will be carried by it. He told her that the joints a man cannot see are the ones that hold the house up. And then, near the very last, his voice gone to a whisper, she had to lean close to catch. He told her that every honest builder hides one thing in his work that only another builder would ever find, and that this was not vanity but a kind of signature, a way of saying, I was here and I did this true. She had not understood him then. She would come to understand him in the trading post at Cobb's Ferry, 11 years after the man who built it had vanished. The post had been raised in 1869 by a trader named Amos Wren. The town remembered him the way towns remember the inconvenient dead, which is to say, barely and with a shrug. He had run the store for 3 years, dealing in flour and powder and traps and bolts of cloth, fair in his prices and slow to extend credit, and then in the spring of 1870 he had simply gone. The county said he had absconded with money he owed to the freight company and to the bank in Bellevue, and the bank had taken the building, and the bank had sold the stock, and the bank had let the building rot when no buyer came. There was a daughter, people said, a girl who had been sent away to relatives before the trouble. There was a wife who had died of fever the winter before Amos disappeared. There was a ledger of debts in the bank's keeping that grew somehow in the years after the man was gone, until the name Amos Wren stood in the county's memory for a cheat and a runner and nothing more. Della knew none of this on the morning she bought the Post. She learned it in pieces, the way she learned everything, by listening more than she spoke, and by working while the talkers talked. The first piece came from the clerk who took her $2, a soft, heavy man named Pruitt who could not keep from telling her what a fool she was. He told her the building was cursed by the man who built it, that Amos Wren had robbed half the valley and run for Canada, and that the only thing she would find inside was rat dirt and regret. She thanked him for the receipt and said nothing about curses, because she did not believe in them, and because she had already noticed that Pruitt's account of Amos Wren was the kind of story men tell when the truth has been made too smooth. The trading post stood alone where the wagon road bent around a stand of cottonwoods, with the brown ribbon of the Snake a quarter-mile off, and the dry hills rising behind it the color of a lion's hide. Up close, it was worse than it had looked from the settlement, and better than the men had said. The fallen corner of the roof had let in a season of weather, and the floor beneath it was soft and black. The main beams, though, were sound. She put her hand on the doorpost and felt the dovetail of the frame under the gray-weathered skin of the wood, and she knew within a minute of touching it that the man who built this place had known what her grandfather knew. The work was honest all the way down. A careless man had owned it, and a careless bank had let it die, but a careful man had made it, and careful men do not run to Canada with the freight company's money. She did not yet have a reason for the thought. She only had the wood, and the wood did not lie. She slept the first night in the soundest corner, wrapped in her blanket, with her back to the good wall and her grandfather's tool beside her, and in the morning she began the work that would take her the better part of 2 months. She did not begin with the secret, because she did not yet know there was one. She began with the roof, because a building open to the sky cannot be saved, and a woman open to the sky cannot survive a salmon country winter. The first task was to learn the roof as a thing made, not as a ruin. She climbed the rafters in the gray morning and went over them by hand, pressing her thumb into each timber to feel where the wood had gone punky and where it still rang sound, and she found that the rot was all in the one fallen corner, where the broken purlin had let the weather in. The frame elsewhere was good. She marked the bad wood with a lump of charcoal from the cold stove and counted what she would need, and the counting told her she would have to fell a tree, because there was no milled lumber within a day's ride, and no money to buy it if there had been. She felled the cottonwood herself, a straight young trunk at the edge of the stand by the road, and the felling took 3 cold afternoons because she would not hurry it and risk the axe or the leg. She cut the notch the way her grandfather had shown her, reading the lean of the tree and the run of the grain, and she dropped it clean across the open ground without splitting the trunk. Then she limbed it and squared it with the adze, walking the length of the timber and taking the high places down a shaving at a time until it was true. She set the new purlin into the old joints, pegged it the way she had been taught, no nails where a joint would serve, and drove the pegs home with the small steady blows her grandfather had taught her in place of the one great blow that splits the wood. The men from Cobb's Ferry rode out once or twice to watch her, the way men ride out to watch a thing they expect to fail. One of them, a big freighter with a red face, called up to her that a roof was no work for a girl, and that she would do better to marry one of them and let the building rot. She did not answer him, because an answer was what he wanted, and the work was what she wanted, and she set another peg while he talked. They saw a girl on a roof in a brown coat, doing work they would have hired 3 men to do, and they rode back to the settlement and said she would never finish before the snow, and they laid small wagers on the week she would give up. She finished before the snow. The first hard storm came in the 3rd week of November, and she watched it from inside a building that held its heat, the new roof tight overhead, a fire in the stove. She had cleaned and blacked and set to rights, and she felt something she had not felt since her grandfather died, which was the particular piece of a thing made sound by her own hands. Then she turned to the inside of the post, and the inside of the post was where the counter was, and the counter was where the story truly began. It ran the length of the back wall, 22 feet of it, a single great slab of fir on a frame of mortised oak, and it was the finest piece of joinery in the building, and perhaps in the county. Della had walked past it a dozen times in her first weeks, too busy with the roof and the floor to give it more than a craftsman's nod. Now, with the storm howling and the work of survival done, she stood before it and looked at it the way her grandfather had taught her to look at a thing, which was slowly, and from more than one angle, and with her hands as much as her eyes. And she saw that the counter was wrong, not wrong in its making, wrong in its measure. She had built counters and cabinets all her girlhood, and she carried the proportions of such things in her body the way a musician carries a tune. This counter was too deep. From the front edge, where a customer would lean, to the back wall behind it, was a span of near 4 feet, and no trader on earth builds a serving counter 4 feet deep, because a clerk cannot reach across it to hand a man his goods. She knelt at the front of it and measured with her grandfather's folding rule, and then she went behind it and measured again, and the two measures did not agree. The counter was deeper from the front than it was from the back. Somewhere inside that great slab of fir and oak, there was a space of more than a foot that the eye did not account for, and the hand could not reach. For a long moment she did not move. The storm threw snow against the window she had glazed. Then she remembered the dead man's whisper, the last thing he had told her, that every honest builder hides one thing in his work that only another builder would ever find. And she understood that Amos Wren had hidden something in his counter, and that it had waited 11 years for a hand that knew how to look. Here is the thing I want you to carry, as she carried it, because it is the heart of why her story is worth the telling. She could have taken an axe to that counter. A hasty woman or a greedy one would have. She did not. She had been taught that the joints a man cannot see are the ones that hold the house up, and she meant to find this man's hidden joint and open it the way he had built it, with respect, because she had already begun to suspect that the man and the building had been wrong together, and that to break the work would be to take the wrongdoer's side. So she began to read the counter. For 3 days she did almost nothing else. She ran her fingers along every seam of it, front and back and underneath, in the gray storm light and by candle when the light failed. She mapped it the way her grandfather had taught her to map a strange piece of work, beginning at one end and moving to the other, and missing nothing. And she made marks in charcoal on the floorboards to record what she found, a small map of a thing she could not yet see into. The underside told her the most. Lying on her back beneath the great slab with the candle held close, she traced the framing and found where the oak ran true, and where behind the suspect panel it stopped short and a second hidden frame began. She found the panel on the backside that did not quite match its neighbors in the run of the grain, fitted so close that a coin's edge would not enter the joint, and she knew that this was the door. Yet she could find no catch, no hinge, no pin. The man had built it to open and built it so that it would never open by accident or by force, and the means of it was hidden the way the space was hidden, in plain sight, waiting for someone who would think the way the builder had thought. She thought the way he had thought. She asked herself where she would put the catch if she were building a thing she wanted hidden from careless men but findable by a careful one. Not under the counter, where a man might brush it by chance. Not on the back, where a clerk's hip would find it a dozen times a day. Somewhere a person would have to mean to touch, and mean to look, and know what they were looking for. She went back to her grandfather's teaching, to the grain and the will of the wood, and to the last thing he had told her, that every honest builder hides one thing in his work that only another builder would ever find. She stopped hunting for a mechanism, and began hunting for a signature. She found it on the 4th day. low on the front face of the counter, in a spot no clerk would ever lean against and no customer would ever see. Down where the slab met the kick of its base there was a small square of inlay, a different wood set into the fir walnut, dark against the pale grain, the size of a man's thumbnail. She had passed her own hand over it 100 times in 3 days without seeing it because it was meant to be felt and not seen, and a person feeling along a counter for a catch feels for an edge, not for a flat square no thicker than a fingernail. It was the only ornament in 22 feet of plain, honest work. It was the signature. She set her thumb upon it and pressed, slow and even, the way you see to peg, and she felt it give and heard within the body of the counter the small dry click of a wooden latch 11 years asleep coming awake. The panel did not spring open. Nothing in that building was made to spring. It settled a half-inch outward on a hidden pivot, and a breath of air came out of the dark behind it, cold and dry and old, the air of a space that had been sealed since before she had left her father's house, and she sat back on her heels in the candlelight and let herself for one moment simply feel the size of what she had found. Behind the panel was not a drawer, as she had half expected. Behind the panel was a passage. The counter's false back was the mouth of it, a low square opening into a space built between the post's inner wall and a second wall she had taken, all these weeks, for the outer one. A man could go through it on his hands and knees. She held the candle into the dark and saw that the passage ran perhaps 8 feet and ended at a small room, no larger than a pantry, framed and floored and walled by the same honest hand that had made the counter, a room that did not exist on the outside of the building, a room that the bank had sold and the county had taxed and the men of Cobb's Ferry had laughed at without ever knowing it was there. She did not go in that night. She was not a woman given to rushing into the dark, and the cold air had told her the space had kept for 11 years and would keep one more. She closed the panel, and she slept, and in the morning when the storm had blown itself out and the sun came hard and white off the new snow, she lit 2 candles and a lantern, and she went through the passage on her hands and knees, with her grandfather's tool in her belt, and she came up into the hidden room, and she found what Amos Wren had left behind. The room was a record. That is the plainest word for it, and the truest. Against one wall stood a small writing desk, and on the desk, under 11 years of fine dust, lay a leather portfolio tied with a cord. Beside it stood a strong box, not large, of iron-banded oak, locked. And on the walls, pegged up where a man would see them every time he came into his secret room, were papers, dozens of them, deeds and receipts and letters and pages of accounts, in a close, careful hand, the hand of a man who wrote the way he built, plainly and to last. Della was a long time understanding what she had found, because she had to read it the way she read the counter, slowly, and more than once. The shape of it came clear, though, to her over the days that followed, by candle and by the cold window light, as she carried the papers out, one careful armful at a time, and laid them on the great fir counter and read them in order. And the shape of it was this: Amos Wren had not robbed the valley. The valley, or one man in it, had robbed Amos Wren. The man's name was Harlan Goss, and in 1881 he was the president of the bank in Bellevue and the holder of more paper on more frontier families than any other man in the southern part of the territory. In 1869, when Amos Wren built his post, Goss had been a smaller man, a land agent and a money lender, working the gap between what the settlers had and what they needed. The papers in the hidden room told a story of how the one man had become the other. They told it in Amos Wren's own hand, and they told it with the receipts to prove it, because Amos Wren had been a careful man, and a careful man keeps copies. Goss had run a scheme as patient and as hidden as the room it was finally found in. He lent money to settlers against their land. He wrote the notes himself. And into the notes, in language the settlers could not parse and would not have been shown if they could, he wrote terms that turned a fair loan into a trap, fees that compounded in the dark, clauses that let him call the whole sum due on a day of his choosing. When a family could not pay on the day he named, he took the land, and he took it lawfully, with papers a judge would uphold, and there was no court in the territory that would look behind the paper to the man. He had taken 11 farms this way between 1869 and 1870. Amos Wren had discovered it because 3 of the 11 families had banked their small savings with him for safekeeping, the way frontier people did with a trader they trusted. And Wren had seen the notes when they came to him in tears, and Wren had understood what he was looking at because he was the kind of man who read a thing slowly and more than once. What Amos Wren had done next was the bravest and the most foolish thing of his life. He had begun to gather the proof. He had made copies of the notes, with the family's leave. He had written to the Territorial Land Office and gotten certified records of the 11 transfers. He had kept the dates and the sums and the names, and he had written it all out fair in his own hand, an accounting of a theft committed with a pen, and he had hidden it in the one place he trusted, the room behind his counter that only a builder would ever find. And then, before he could carry it to anyone with the power to act on it, he had vanished. In the spring of 1870, and the county had been told he was a runner and a cheat, and the bank had taken his building, and Harlan Goss had risen to be the richest man in the Southern Territory on a foundation of falsified paper. And no one had ever looked behind the counter. Della sat with that knowledge a long while in the cold, hidden room, the lantern throwing her shadow huge against the honest wall, and she understood that she had not bought a wrecked trading post for $2. She had bought the grave of a man's courage and the proof of another man's crime, and the dead man behind the counter had been waiting 11 years for a hand that would read what careless men could not. What had become of Amos Wren himself, she could not learn from the papers, and she never fully learned it, though she came to believe she knew. The last dated page in his hand was a letter, never sent, written to his daughter, telling her that he had done a hard thing for the right reason, and that if she ever came back to the post, she should look for his signature, the small dark square of walnut, and trust what she found behind it. The letter was dated the 11th of April, 1870. After that, there was nothing. A man who has gathered proof against the most powerful man in the territory, and then disappears between one day and the next, has not, as a rule, gone to Canada with the freight company's money. Della did not write that thought down anywhere. She only folded the unsent letter into a square and held it against her palm the way she held her own receipt, and she resolved that whatever else she did, she would not let the work go unread a second time. She told no one at first. This was not fear, though she had reason for fear. It was the same patience that had carried her through the roof and the floor and the reading of the counter. She knew that to walk into Cobb's Ferry waving a dead man's papers and crying theft would change nothing, because she was a girl of 20 who had bought a cursed building for $2, and Harlan Goss was the bank, and the bank was the law's friend, and the word of the one against the other was no contest at all. The papers were not an accusation, they were evidence, and evidence does its work quietly, in the right hands in the right order. Her grandfather had taught her that you do not drive a joint home with one great blow that splits the wood. You seed it with many small ones. So, she began to seed it. The first small blow was a woman named Sari Combs, who lived in a sod house 8 miles up the valley, and who had been in 1869 the wife of one of the 11 men whose farms Harlan Goss had taken. Della had found the name in Amos Wren's accounts and ridden out on a borrowed mule to find her, following the valley road until it dwindled to a track, and the track to a path between 2 low hills, and she had found a widow grown old before her time, scraping a living off ground she rented from the very bank that had taken her own. The sod house was clean and poor, the dirt floor swept hard as stone, a single window of greased paper letting in a brown light. Della did not show her the papers at once. She sat at the woman's table and drank her thin coffee and listened. the way she always listened, and she let Sari Combs tell the story of how she had lost her land. The story came out slow and then fast, the way a thing long held comes out. There had been a loan, a small one, for seed, and a plow. In a year, the rains failed. The note had seemed fair when her husband signed it, for neither of them could read the close lines at the bottom, and the agent had read it to them in his own smooth voice. Then a fee had appeared that they had never heard named. Then another. Then the whole sum was called due on a morning in March, with the ground still frozen, and no crop in, and no money on earth to pay it. And the judge in town had looked at the paper and not at them, and by April the land was the bank's, and they were tenants on it, and her husband had not lived 2 winters after. The story matched the paper in every particular, the fee that appeared from nowhere, the day the note was called, the judge who would not look. When the telling was done, Della laid 1 page on the table, a certified copy of the note with the buried clause underlined in Amos Wren's careful hand, and she said only that a man had kept this 11 years behind a counter, because he had meant for it to be found. Sari Combs put her hand flat on the page as though to feel whether it was real. She read the underlined line, moving her lips, for she had learned her letters late and slowly in the years of her widowhood, and when she came to the end of it, she was quiet a long moment. She did not weep, because women like Sari Combs had wept all they had to weep long before. She looked at Della across the table, and she asked, in a voice gone quiet and firm, what the girl meant to do with it. What Della meant to do with it took the rest of that winter and the spring beyond. She did it the way she did everything, in order. Each piece seated before the next was begun. She found 4 more of the 11 families, or their widows and their grown children, scattered down the valley and into the next, and from each she gathered the human half of the story to lay alongside the paper half. She copied the most important documents twice over by her own hand, so that no fire or theft could erase them, and she kept 1 set hidden in the room behind the counter where they had waited so long already, and she carried the other set to a place Harlan Goss would never think to look, which was the Territorial Land Office in Boise City, where a young clerk named Edmund Tice had charge of the records of transfer. Tice was the only titled man of business in the whole affair, and Della came to him not with a story, but with a question, certified record against certified record, asking only that he compare the bank's filed papers with the copies Amos Wren had certified 11 years before. The young clerk laid the 2 sets side by side, and his face changed as he read, and he understood before she had to say a word that the dates and the sums in the bank's filings had been altered after the fact to paper over the very clauses Wren had copied clean. That was the joint-seated home, not a confrontation, a comparison. The land office could not ignore a discrepancy in its own certified records once it had been laid before its own clerk, and the clerk, who was an honest man in a small office, did what honest men in small offices can do, which is to follow the rule exactly where the rule points. He filed a formal question on the 11 transfers. The question went up the chain that such questions go up, slowly, in the way of land offices, and it landed at last on the desk of the Territorial Surveyor General, and from there it became a matter that could not be made to disappear, because it was no longer one girl's word but the Territory's own paper contradicting itself. I will not pretend the wheel turned fast, because it did not, and Della never expected it to. The frontier gives nothing back quickly, not a sound roof, and not a righted wrong. It turned all the same. Through the spring and summer of 1882, the question worked its way through the offices and the courts, and Harlan Goss, who had built an identity on the systematic erasure of other men's claims, found for the first time that the paper he had always commanded had turned in his hand. He was not arrested in a dramatic scene. There was no reckoning on a dusty street. He was simply, over a season, undone, as the 11 transfers were one by one reopened, and the altered filings exposed and the family's claims restored to the record. His fortune had been built on those 11 thefts and the larger ones they had taught him to attempt, and when the foundation was pulled, the rest of it leaned and fell the way the corner of the trading post roof had leaned and fallen, slowly, and then all at once. He left the territory before the worst of it landed. Where he went, Della neither knew nor cared. He became in the end exactly what he had made of Amos Wren, a name the county remembered with a shrug, and then did not remember at all. The restitution was slower even than the undoing, and it was the part Della cared about most because it was the part her grandfather would have cared about. The land could not all be given back as it had been, for some of it had passed through 3 hands since, and some of the wronged were dead. The record, though, was set right. Every one of the 11 names restored to its true standing, the theft struck through, and the truth written over it in the territory's own ink. Sari Combs got her own ground back, the sod house and the 8 acres around it, free of the bank's rent, in the autumn of 1882, 2 years and a season after Della had bought the post for $2. Della carried the deed out to her herself on the borrowed mule, and the old woman read it twice, slowly, the way Della had taught her without meaning to, and then she folded it into a square and put it inside her own glove, against her palm, and the 2 women sat at the table and drank thin coffee and did not say very much, because the thing that had been done did not need a speech to carry it. Della Hart never grew rich from the trading post, and she never tried to. She had found a fortune of falsified paper, and she had spent it, every page, on the restoration of the record, keeping nothing for herself but the building she had bought and the work of her own hands. The post became a real store again under her keeping, for the wagon road still ran north to the salmon camps, and men still needed flour and powder and traps and cloth, and she dealt in them fair and slow to extend credit, the way the man before her had, because she had come to think of Amos Wren as a kind of grandfather, too. A careful man who had hidden one true thing in his work and trusted it would be found. She kept his counter exactly as he had built it. She never sealed the passage again. She left the small dark square of walnut where his thumb had pressed it, and her own had pressed it after, and now and then, when a careless customer leaned on the great fir slab and joked about the cursed man who built it, she would say only that the man who built it had been honest all the way down, and she would let it rest there, because the work said the rest of it better than her voice could. The men who had laughed at her in the clerk's office on that cold October morning came around the way such men come around, not with apologies, which were beyond them, but with a slow change in the way they spoke her name. The girl who would freeze before the snow melted became the woman who held the store on the North Road, and then simply Della Hart, who could set a roof beam truer than any 3 men they could hire, and who had done some quiet thing once with the bank and the land office that none of them fully understood but all of them respected. Pruitt, the clerk, lived long enough to buy his flour from her, and he never spoke of curses again, and that was as near to an apology as his kind ever came, and it was enough. She lived a long life in that building. She married late and quietly, a freighter named John Salt, who admired her work before he admired her face, and who never once asked her to fight the grain of who she was. And she raised 2 children in the rooms behind the store, and she taught them both, the girl and the boy alike, to read a thing slowly and more than once, and to look for the joints that cannot be seen, because those are the ones that hold the house up. When she was an old woman, and the territory had become a state, and the wagon road had become a county road with the freight wagons giving way to other things, she would sometimes take a grandchild by the hand and lead them behind the counter and show them the small dark square of walnut, and let them press it, and let them hear the dry click of the wooden latch and watch their faces in the lantern light as the cold old air came out of the dark. She would tell them about a man named Amos Wren, who had been called a cheat by a county too lazy to read what he left behind, and who had hidden the truth in the one place he trusted because he ran out of time to carry it into the light himself. She would tell them that she had bought his grave for $2 and not known it, and that the building had been honest all the way down, and that the proof of a man's worth is sometimes sealed up for years in a place careless hands will never open. And then she would close the panel gently, because nothing in that building was made to be forced, and she would lead the child back out into the warmth of the store, and the counter would keep it secret the way it always had ready for the next careful hand. The last thing she did before she died, they say, in the winter of 1931, was to ask that the post not be sold to anyone who would tear out the counter. Her daughter kept the promise. The great fir slab stood the length of the back wall long after Della was gone, 22 feet of honest work on a frame of mortised oak, and low on its front face, where no one leaned and no one looked, the small, dark square of walnut stayed where 2 careful hands had pressed it, dark against the pale grain, the only ornament in all that plain, true work, the signature of a builder who had meant to last. Have you ever wondered how many true things are sealed up in the places no one thinks to look, waiting only for the patience to find them? If this story stayed with you, there is another like it waiting of a woman and a thing the world threw away, and what she found when she would not let it lie.